Hey CW Bio, Mr. Kennedy here. Today we're going to dive into chapter 14 of your textbook and look at some complex hereditary patterns and human genetic diseases. Okay. As we get rolling with this, one of the things that I just want to remind you of is that, the inheritance patterns that we're going to be talking about are still deeply rooted in the things that we learned about Gregor Mendel. So we're going to talk about recessive disorders and dominant disorders. But at the end of the day, you got to connect back to what you learned with Mendel in order to understand how these are passed on. Second thing I want to stress is that these are genetic disorders, which means they're not contagious or communicable. The only way you can really get these genetic disorders is to inherit genes from your parents, right? So it's not like catching a cold or the flu where, being around somebody that has one of these genetic disorders means that you might catch it too. That has nothing to do with it. It's all about your parents. So you don't have to be afraid to be around somebody with a genetic disorder. And lastly, most of these genetic disorders, well, they're not curable because they're genetic disorders. So unless we change your genes, we can't really get rid of the genetic disorder. We can treat your symptoms though, and in a lot of cases, you can live a perfectly normal, healthy, and happy life as long as you manage your symptoms within these disorders, okay? So let's dive in first with some simple recessive hereditary disorders. Most genetic disorders are actually caused by recessive alleles. Those that are caused by dominant alleles would be passed on at such a high rate that, well, pretty much everybody would have them. So the fact that, we have genetic disorders that are pretty rare is in and of itself an indication that they're passed on through recessive inheritance. Recessive inheritance means that the only way you're going to ever express or show these genetic disorders is if you inherit two recessive alleles, one from each parent, for a particular disorder. So in order to pass this on or to even be at risk for passing this on, two people who would, be thinking about having children would both have to be carriers for a genetic disorder. That means they would both have to be heterozygous. The only way you know if you're heterozygous is to do some sort of gene testing to study your DNA, or to maybe do some investigation along your family lines to see who, if anybody, in your family history has had these genetic disorders on both sides of the family, the man and the woman. If both a husband and wife are, carriers for a genetic disorder, well, at the end of the day, if you remember what you learned in Mendelian inheritance, they would be heterozygous and still only have a 25% chance of passing on a genetic disorder to one of their offspring. So the odds of inheriting a genetic disorder are pretty low, okay? First genetic disorder I want to share with you is called cystic fibrosis, or CF. Cystic fibrosis is a fairly common genetic disorder amongst Caucasian Americans. Cystic fibrosis occurs in 1 in 28 Americans. And when I say cystic fibrosis occurs, that doesn't mean that 1 in every 28 people, in a room actually has it. It means that, 1 in 28 statistically across the entire country is a carrier for it. So if two of those carriers had children, then again, at the end of the day, there'd be a 25% chance of their offspring carrying or having that disorder, okay? I'll do some Punnett squares with you in a different video just to kind of show you how this works when we look at these complex, hereditary patterns through Punnett squares. 1 in 2,500 children born to Caucasian Americans will inherit the disorder. Remember what I said about 25%? Well, there's your number, okay? 2,500 individuals, okay? If you're not real familiar with cystic fibrosis and what it does, well, let me just lay it out for you like this. When you inherit cystic fibrosis, you inherit a defective protein in the plasma membrane of your cells. So basically, this defective protein causes the accumulation of a really thick mucus in your lungs and in your digestive system. Now, again, this is not something that we can cure outright because we can't get into your DNA and fix the problem, at least with current technology. Maybe in the future in genetic engineering, who knows? We'll see. But for now, you can lead a perfectly normal life as long as you manage those symptoms. Okay, there are medications to take to reduce the mucus secretions and other physical treatments that you can do to maintain a healthy life. Okay, The second genetic disorder that I want to share with you is called TaySachs disease. TaySachs disease is a recessive disorder of your central nervous system. Now, in this case, the recessive allele, it creates an absence of an enzyme that normally breaks down a lipid that is produced and stored in your central nervous system. Because the lipid fails to break down, it's going to ultimately accumulate in your cells, and it can be fatal. Fatal at a very, very young age, because that accumulation starts from the point a baby is, growing inside of its mother. And infants don't last very long after birth as a result of this lipid accumulation. Okay. Next one is phenylketonuria. Phenylketonuria, or PKU, is a recessive disorder that results from an absent enzyme that normally converts one amino acid, phenylalanine, into another amino acid, tyrosine. So over the course of your life, kind of like what we saw with Tay-Sachs disease, you could potentially build up toxic levels of phenylalanine in your body. So this one's a little different in that, phenylalanine will build up as you eat things, okay? And when you're inside your mother, attached to her body through the umbilical cord and placenta, if you have PKU, well, it doesn't hurt you, doesn't do anything, because mom's body's doing all the work to process the phenylalanine for you while you are in utero. After you're born and you're on your own, that's when the phenylalanine can start to build up if you have PKU. So people that have PKU, again, we can't, cure the disorder, but just through simple diet modifications and care in what you eat, again, you can live a perfectly normal life, just avoiding phenylalanine. We as a society know that there are people out there with phenylketonuria who need to avoid phenylalanine. So we've actually got products in today's world that are labeled with warnings. Just jump to that warning right here. Like if you're looking at a diet soda can, there'll be a little tab on it that'll say hey, warning, phenylketonurics. This contains phenylalanine, FYI. Okay. So going back to what other information is that you need to know about phenylketonuria, I'll go back to that slide with the definition on it. Because phenylalanine cannot be broken down, it and its byproducts will accumulate over your life and result in severe damage to your central nervous system. So if you have PKU, definitely want to avoid phenylalanine, okay? PKU test is normally performed on all infants a few days after birth, just to be sure. It doesn't matter who your parents are, or what their history is. We're going to test you for PKU or, the ability to digest and break down this phenylalanine shortly after birth. Infants that are affected by PKU right after birth are given a diet that's low in phenylalanine until their brains are fully developed, okay? Because if you start accumulating this phenylalanine before your brain is even developed, obviously it can do a lot of damage. Ironically, the success of treating phenylketonuria infants has resulted in a new problem. Can you guess what that new problem is? Okay. The new problem is that more children are surviving and living longer with the disease. Okay. And as a result, we have more people carrying this disease and passing it on to future generations. So if a female who is homozygous recessive for PKU becomes pregnant, the high phenylalanine levels in her blood can actually also damage her fetus, her developing baby, okay? Not to mention the fact that she can pass this on to her offspring. This problem occurs even if the fetus is heterozygous and would be phenotypically normal, because the baby's body can't process all the phenylalanine that it's being given from its mother. Okay, so here's that soda can again. All right, let's go on to simple dominant heredity. In simple dominant heredity, instead of you inheriting 2 recessive alleles to get a genetic disorder, you only need to inherit 1, okay, 1 dominant gene. So the odds of inheriting a simple dominant genetic disorder are exponentially higher than a recessive one, because all you need is one gene. If you have two people that are homozygous for that dominant gene, then that basically means all their offspring are going to get it. If they're heterozygous for that dominant gene, then like there's a 75% chance that their offspring are going to get it. Remember your Punnett squares from Mendelian inheritance. Okay, so some of the dominant traits that we're going to look at here aren't really genetic disorders, but instead like fairly common and normal things. Like this young lady here who is exhibiting some dominant human traits like a widow's peak, right? So cleft chin, widow's peak hairline, hitchhiker's thumb, almond-shaped eyes, thick lips, the presence of hair in the midsection of your fingers. These are all considered dominant traits. So if you look at this picture of this young lady, the little point that she has up here on her forehead is considered a widow's peak, and it's a dominant trait. So later in life, when or if she chooses to have children, regardless of whom she has children with, since she carries that dominant trait, there's a 75% chance that her children will also have a widow's peak, 25% chance that they do not. There are incidences where if she were to have children with somebody with a widow's peak, then all of her children are going to have it, okay? And the potential that she could drive the odds down as low as maybe 50%, depending upon her specific genotype. If she is homozygous for widow's peak, then the statistic I gave you before with 75% of her children having it is true. If she's heterozygous, then the odds of her passing it on to her children can drop to as low as 50%. Go back to your Mendelian Punnett squares. I'll practice a few of these with you in another video to prove my point, okay? One genetic disease that I want you to be aware of that's a serious one is Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is a lethal genetic disorder that's caused by a rare dominant allele. Huntington's disease is typically fatal to those that carry it, those that have it, by about the age of 40. It results in the breakdown of certain areas of the brain. The brain can literally start digesting itself from the inside out, okay? Ordinarily, a dominant allele with such severe effects, well, it would over time erase itself from the human population because those that have it would perish. The reason that Huntington's disease is still around is because there are people who inadvertently have children without actually knowing that they have Huntington's disease. So they've inadvertently passed the genetic disorder on before their symptoms kick in, is what I'm getting at. So at the end of the day, there is a small proportion of our population that still carries and still passes on Huntington's disease, but it is rare. This is what a pedigree of someone with Huntington's disease might look like. Those people that are shaded, right, are carrying Huntington's disease. And you can see that it's passed on in high proportion to future generations. And unfortunately, anyone that inherits it is destined to pass away from it. There is not a treatment or a cure for Huntington's disease, okay? All right, so then that brings us to some complex hereditary patterns in people that aren't genetic diseases, and complex hereditary patterns in lower life forms that we can, examine at a distance here. Things like codominance, incomplete dominance, multiple allele and polygenic inheritance, and even sex-linked inheritance, okay? So I'm going to run you through some of these again in another video. I'll do some practice problems with you. Today is just about getting some definitions under our belt so we have a basic understanding of what these are. So when we talk about these complex inheritance patterns that are not genetic diseases, basically we're looking at inheritance patterns that follow Mendelian guidelines, but there's some tweaks to it. Like there's no really like true dominant trait versus a true recessive trait like you saw in simple Mendelian inheritance. We'll run into some issues with that. And sometimes we have more than one gene that's necessary to give us a trait. In simple Mendelian inheritance, if you remember what I told you about Mendel's rule of unit factors, you had to get one gene from like mom, one gene from dad, and those two things came together and it gave you whatever you saw in the mirror. Well, in some of these cases, it's not one gene from mom, one gene from dad. It might be 3 or 4 genes from mom and 3 or 4 genes from dad that all have to work together in order to give you a trait, right? So that's where it gets complicated. We won't do much in the way of Punnett squares here because it's really hard to do a Punnett square where we're tracking something like polygenic inheritance, okay? So complex patterns of inheritance, learn it like this. Patterns of inheritance that are explained by Mendel's experiments are often referred to as simple inheritance, but many inheritance patterns are way more complex than what Mendel's simple processes portrayed, okay? So we're going to dive in first to the world of incomplete dominance, or the appearance of a third phenotype. If we were talking about tall plants and short plants, Mendel's original experiment, and those plants exhibited like incomplete or even codominance, Mendel would have had a huge problem on his hands. Read what this says. When inheritance follows a pattern of dominance, heterozygous and homozygous dominant individuals both have the same phenotype. When traits are inherited in an incomplete dominance pattern, the phenotype of the heterozygous, well, it's an intermediate between the two homozygotes. So what that means is if I was big T, as a pea plant, I'd be tall. If I was big T, using Mendel's simple dominance idea, I would be tall. If I was little t, I'd be short. Well, if we use incomplete dominance, here's the problem. Big T, little t would be medium size, okay? Remember when Mendel was doing his work initially, most people thought that offspring were a blend of the parents. If pea plants exhibited height heredity in the way I just described, incomplete dominance, Mendel basically would have proved that idea true and accurate, and we'd probably be talking about somebody else now as the father of genetics, right? Because, you know, like everything he would have done would have basically supported this idea of blending when it's not really true for all traits. So an incomplete dominance, if you had a tall plant crossed with a short plant, homozygous big T would be tall, homozygous little t would be short, and heterozygous big T, you'd be medium. There's a third phenotype, okay? So here's some examples using snapdragons as opposed to pea plants. And in snapdragons, we're going to look at flower color. Homozygous red-flowered snapdragon plant, big R, is going to be crossed with a homozygous white-flowered snapdragon, which is big R prime, and in this case, all of the offspring would have pink flowers. Splending, okay? So here's that cross. So if Mendel was studying snapdragons instead of pea plants, like I said, he would have proved everybody's ideas in the 1800s true, and we'd be talking about somebody else with regard to like the father of genetics. So what's going on here is that big R allele for red flower color cannot completely hide the R prime allele for white flower color. So you get something that's in between. They're both expressed equally, so you get pink, okay? And as you look at these Punnett squares, you can see the offspring, right, are all pink. Now here's something weird. If you take these pink offspring and you cross them, look what happens in your F2 generation. So if you were studying these as a, monk in the 1800s and you did this cross, you might like question, how could I cross 2 pink plants and all of a sudden get like, red flowers, pink flowers, and white flowers out of it? Okay, it's incomplete dominance. All right. So the new phenotype occurs because the flowers contain enzymes that control pigment production. The R allele codes for an enzyme that produces red. The R prime allele codes for a defective enzyme that basically makes no pigment. Because that heterozygous has only one copy of the R allele, its flowers appear pink because they produce only half the amount of red pigment the red homozygote flowers still produce. Okay, so the red homozygous flowers have 2 genes to produce that, red pigment to make them red, and the heterozygotes only have 1. Okay, so again, that's what it looks like in terms of the Punnett square. All right, codominance. Codominance is a lot like incomplete dominance, but in this case, the phenotypes of both homozygotes are produced in the heterozygous individual. So in codominance, both alleles are fully expressed. Okay. Now, there really isn't a great example that I can show you of codominance, but you can imagine those snapdragons, instead of being pink, the flowers would probably be like red and white striped, something like that. There are cows that are called roan cows, and if you get really close to them, they have like red hairs and white hairs on their fur, and if you look at them from a distance, they almost look pink, right? So that's an example of codominance in nature. Next thing to look at is multiple, phenotypes that occur from multiple alleles. Although each trait has only 2 alleles in the patterns of heredity you've studied thus far, it's more common than 2 alleles to control a trait in a population. So traits that are controlled by more than 2 alleles are called multiple allele traits. Probably the best example of multiple allele traits without getting into a lot of technicality is skin color, in humans, skin color, hair color, eye color. It's the additive effect of multiple alleles that actually give us all the different variations that we see in skin color, hair color, and eye color. It's not just cut and dry, here's one end of the spectrum, here's the other end of the spectrum. There's a lot of variation. Like just looking at people's hair, you can't just say, well, there's black hair, blonde hair, red hair, brown hair. Like there's only 4 types. No, because like I just know in the case of blonde hair, like there's all kinds of shades of blonde, right? You could be like almost red haired blonde and be like what they call strawberry blonde, right? You could be like, towhead blonde where your hair is like super white. You could be like dirty blonde where your hair is kind of brownish blonde. Like, you see what I'm getting at? Like there's all this like shading that goes on, and it's dependent upon how many dominant alleles you inherit, how dark your hair becomes, your eyes, and your skin. Okay. Last one we're going to look at here is gender determination. So basically, how your gender is determined is through the inheritance of 2 chromosomes that are referred to as your X and Y chromosomes. In humans, the diploid number of chromosomes is 46 or 23 pairs. 22 of those pairs of chromosomes basically are what are called autosomes, and they're responsible for making everything else in your body except for gender. The last pair of chromosomes that you inherit, your 23rd, they're not a completely like accurately matched pair of chromosomes. They differ in males than they do in females. So when you look at them in a karyotype, we refer to them as your X and Y chromosomes or your sex chromosomes. So this last pair of chromosomes referred to as your X and Y chromosomes or your sex chromosomes to determine your gender. If you inherit 2 X chromosomes or X appearing chromosomes at your 23rd location, you are considered genetically female. If you inherit an X and a Y at your 23rd position, you are considered genetically male. Okay. And again, we'll do some practice Punnett squares with this in a different video so that you can see how gender is passed through generation, from one generation to the next. Okay. Males usually, when they produce their gametes, have 1 X and 1 Y chromosome in each of their gametes. So, males are by and large responsible for determining the gender of the future offspring, which I'll show you through these Punnett squares. Females have 2 X chromosomes, so they can really only produce X-containing gametes, nothing else. Okay. So when you think about a very simple representation of that future Punnett square, I'm just going to show it to you like this. When a female makes her gametes, she's going to have the possibility of passing on nothing but X chromosomes. The male can pass on an X or a Y, right? So the male, depending on which sperm cell reaches the egg first, will determine the gender of the offspring, right? And as you look at this Punnett square, you should take note of the fact that you have basically a 50-50 chance of having a boy or a girl. And those statistics or probability odds, however you want to refer to them, play out every time 2 people have a child. What I mean by that is there's no guarantee that the first child, if you look at this Punnett square, from mating of any male or female has to be female, okay? Your first child could be male. If your first child was female, there's also no guarantee that your second child has to be male, and vice versa. So the idea is that every time mating occurs, there's always a 50-50 chance of having a male or a female. In conjunction with this idea of sex determination, there are some genetic traits that are controlled by these sex chromosomes. We call them sex-linked traits. So there are a few things that we can inherit that are carried on these X and Y chromosomes. And they range from, kind of ridiculous and benign things like male pattern baldness to things like, hemophilia, okay? So the idea in these sex-linked traits is that they're typically carried by females and expressed by males, because if a female passes one of these things on and it's like a recessive disorder, there's the potential for another X chromosome from a male to mask that recessive disorder so that the offspring doesn't express it. If you're a boy, you get your X chromosome from your mom and your Y chromosome from your dad. So if mom gives you a defective gene on an X chromosome, well, it's yours, right? And there's nothing that you can do to hide it, okay? So just to kind of give you an idea, here's a Punnett square that shows like eye color in fruit flies, okay? So eye color is a sex-linked trait in fruit flies, and you have a red-eyed female being mated with a white-eyed male. And as you look at the Punnett squares coming across, right, not only can you see that the male is responsible for gender determination, but you can also see that mom can carry the gene for eye color, but maybe not express it, white eye color, but not express it. And if the boy inherits his X chromosome from her, then he's going to express it because there's nothing to mask it in the Y chromosome from his father. Okay, color blindness, male pattern baldness, hemophilia. These are all examples of sex-linked inheritance, and I will show you Punnett squares on how to map those things out in a later video. Okay, so the last thing that I'm going to mention to you here with regard to inheritance is polygenic inheritance. Polygenic inheritance is the inheritance pattern of a trait that's controlled by 2 or more genes. The genes can be on the same chromosome or different chromosomes, and each gene may have 2 or more alleles. Uppercase and lowercase letters are used to represent these alleles. And this is where we get that whole idea of, blood typing and skin color and hair color, eye color, all that kind of stuff like that, that plays out as we inherit more than one gene to give us a trait. Again, I'm not going to do Punnett squares for like polygenic inheritance because it's like way too hard to like track what's going on through a Punnett square. All right, ladies and gents, that's a lot of information. That's a lot of detail on human genetic disorders. Complex heredity. I hope this has been informative to you. You've learned a lot, and I'll see you next time.